LDComics is a women-led, welcoming to all forum run by creators. We champion the graphic novel form, particularly works with an autobiographical voice. Our activity is towards supporting and equipping graphic novelists, especially but not exclusively people identifying as women. Established in 2009 by Sarah Lightman and Nicola Streeten as Ladies Do Comics, today LDComics is run by a committee of 6 published graphic novelists: Charlotte Bailey, Rachel Ball, Emma Burley, Lou Crosby, Wallace Eates and Nicola Streeten. From the start, the core of LDC's activity has been the monthly meetings, hosting presentations from invited guests to a public audience in a welcoming atmosphere for networking and making friends. The introduction of LDC online monthlies aims to replicate the joy and stimulation of our physical meetups. Everyone is welcome.
All right, so hi everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the approach for my work, which is a mixed media approach. And this approach is quite important to me, so I'm going to explain how it has affected my previous work and how it is influencing my graphic novels. So I am an Italian-born, UK-based mixed media artist. I've been living in London for about 10 years, but I still have a very strong Italian accent, which I probably will never lose. I've been working a lot in these 10 years with videography, photography, illustration, and animation. And I've really enjoyed putting together these different visual languages and trying to break barriers between traditional forms of expression. So why am I using a mixed media approach? To understand that, I'm going to talk about my first job in London, which was as a traveling photographer, a documentary photographer for NGOs and international development organizations. I've been traveling to Tanzania, Gambia, India, and Bangladesh, documenting their projects there. And it was very exciting for me to be able to provide a platform to people whose voice is not usually heard. I talked with people who were not very experienced with media and others who really enjoyed photographs and videos. And despite all differences, they all had something in common. They didn't just want to talk about their story. They wanted more control on the storytelling. They wanted to have a 360 degrees, a more complete, a mixed media or multimedia approach. So that's what we did together. We took photographs of them and they talked with their own voice. They included drawings, illustrations that they made to talk about how different education projects or disability projects had affected them. So we came out with annual reviews and publications for the NGOs I was working for, where all these different outlets all come together to tell a more immersive story. When I came back to London, I focused on my animation work for charities and NGOs. And I tried to push this mixed media approach a little further. I tried to photograph people, surroundings, and buildings, and mix the photographs with text, drawings, illustrations, and even collages of pieces of paper, fabric, and any other material that I could find. The idea was to create videos that would be a little more open, a little more joyful and free, in order to talk to an international audience and include a story from many different points of view. A couple of years ago, I started focusing on my artistic practice, and I came up with a series of artwork which was showcased in art galleries in London and I also included it in an illustrated book. In Handmade, I mixed photographs with paintings, watercolors, acrylics, and different pieces of papers and materials. The idea is to expand the scene, the world of a picture. It's to try and go beyond the limitations of a 2D flat images and help the viewer to be in the shoes of that old man on Waterloo Bridge. I wanted the viewer to see what he was looking at, smell the same smells, feel the cold, be sort of attacked by all sides and all senses. So I've summarized a little bit my mixed media approach to understand how I moved from being a documentary photographer to becoming a published author of graphic novels like Motherland, A Wartime Childhood. Motherland is my latest graphic novel. That is the one that was long listed at LDComics last year, and it's been published in Italian in Italy with Becco Giallo Editore, which is one of the main Italian publishers for comics. It is a graphic memoir which uses a strong mixed media approach. But what is a graphic memoir? A graphic memoir focuses on a story that has really happened and tries to keep the authenticity and the fresh approach of the oral testimony by using the same words of the person who's been talking, who's been experiencing those times. The graphic memoir in question is a collection of impressions and memories of my own aunt, who is called Graziella, and she was born in 1932 in fascist Italy. My aunt grew up and was entirely educated in a totalitarian regime. She went to a totalitarian school where all lessons were about principle of fascist culture, Mussolini, and the need of turning Italy into a strong totalitarian country. My aunt is a normal person. She's not a partisan who fought the resistance against the Nazi. She's not a political leader who distinguished himself for some great initiative. Of course, it's very important to talk about partisans and influential people because we learn a lot from their adventures and their experiences. But they only represent an exception of the population. They are not the average Italian who in 1940s was living in Italy and was supporting the fascist regime. Most people were just like my aunt Graziella. They were like children even when they were adults. They were people who simply went along with whatever the leader said and did not understand how bad things were turning until it was way too late. I think it's quite important to empathize with a young girl. It's a different point of view, which we don't find so much in historical books. And also, it turns an individual story with the small s in a collective story with the capital S, the story of an entire nation. In Motherland, I do a quick summary of fascist history. I talk about Mussolini, how he abolished all parties at the opposition and turned Italy into a totalitarian regime. I talk about how he aligned his policies to Hitler's and went ahead with colonialist oppression, autarky, ethnic persecution, and propaganda in all levels of public life. But this is not a story about fascism or Mussolini. It's not a story about a man. It's a story about a girl, and it's a coming of age story. In this book, Graziella is around 6 years old when the fascist school starts for her, and it's around 13 years old when the Second World War ends. So we really see the development of a young, happy child into a much more scared but also responsible young adult. I imagine that Graziella had an imaginary friend, which is something that a lot of kids have. Imaginary friends help children understand what is good and what is bad, take their own decisions, and grow up as people. I imagined that in such a hard time like fascist times, you really needed an invisible friend who would protect you and help you when bombings were happening. But this imaginary friend is not there just to comfort Graziella. He is there to open her eyes, to make her understand that the fascist laws were very absurd and irrational, and there was no point in following them. So the friend is there to sort of develop a critic sense in the head of Graziella, who will grow into a young woman thanks to her friend. In this book, um, I started off by doing the opposite of a graphic novel. In fact, my first step was to make a film. That was my first idea. I sat down my aunt in front of me. I asked her lots of questions, and I recorded her anecdotes of the war. Whilst filming her, she showed me plenty of documents, especially pictures, photographs her dad had taken at the time. And I was very fascinated by those photographs because they show in an intimate, fresh, authentic way how people were living their everyday life. I decided to include those photographs in the film, but they weren't particularly strong. They weren't communicating me much. And that's when it hit me. I understood that those pictures were perfect on the flat page. They were perfect in a graphic novel. So I spent quite a while trying to really merge the photographs within the drawings that I had created. I didn't want them to be separated. I wanted this mixed media approach that I talked about earlier to really emerge in the pages of this graphic novel, to really communicate with the different parts of the page. So, for example, in this page, we can see Graziella dressed like a little farmer because fascists loved the idea of having a great rural past and didn't lose any occasion to boast about it. So the drawing, the photograph, and the text in rhyme all talk to each other to create a storytelling. This is a graphic memoir, so it's the story of a family, and specifically of my own family, of my aunt Graziella, who we see on top left, but also of her sisters and of her parents. Graziella was part of a typical large fascist family. In fact, Mussolini would give awards and money to mothers who had lots of kids because he felt that a nation would be strong only if it had a lot of citizens who, of course, were all trained and brainwashed since day one at school. But it's not just the photographs that really interested me when I make the book. It's also the report cards, which show how in school, from the first year of primary school, disciplines like history and culture of fascism would be taught to young kids. But let's have a look at the covers of these report cards because they are pieces of art by themselves. They show the strength of a colonial power that Italy was seeking to challenge other countries like the UK, for example. They show weapons and the aim of Mussolini. Everything is about strength, about rigor, about discipline. I would argue that those are not appropriate content for a 6 years old, But at the time, the idea of Mussolini was to create a new Italian, man and woman, that would be very strong and would die to save and defend the motherland. Everything from the books used in class to the exercises, from the school books to the notebooks, were very deeply embedded in fascist ideology. I spent 4 years going in markets, libraries, shops, or on the internet to find all these artifacts, and I found a ton. It's really not difficult to find those objects. They are everywhere in Italian houses, but they are not important. First of all, they are very cheap. I bought them for a tenner or sometimes even less because they were produced in large scale, so they are in so many copies, they can't be expensive. But in Italy, no one cares about them. There is no investigation of them, there is no serious analysis. And I argue this is because Italians have not quite came to terms with the past. They haven't quite accepted the responsibility for it, and they haven't developed the critical sense that is needed and that other countries like Germany have certainly tried at least to face. I stopped on this page because it's quite interesting to see how even in maths lessons it was possible to communicate pieces of that fascist ideology I was talking about. I think maths is neutral, objective, it's matter of fact. And I was shocked when I saw that even maths can be manipulated to tell the principles of war, of aggression, of killing, of fascist times. Everything that was taught in school was about colonial power and ethnic persecution against the Jews, the gypsies, homosexuals, anyone who was not your average Italian. And so all lessons about geography or history were really focused on colonialism and Mussolini life or fascist history. You can see from these examples how I like combining little cuttings from newspaper articles, posters, postcards, um, notebooks, stamps. I like taking those, putting them all together, and try to really create a barrage of different forms of communication to attract the viewer. This is because the fascist propaganda machine was multimedia in its own nature. And so, with my own approach, I tried to mimic that multimedia approach. Fascists were very sophisticated in their communication machine. They would talk with films, but also with clothing. They would use paintings, but also advertising. They would make some radio programs, but also create entire cities that had architecture and an urban structure which was influenced by fascist mentality. I think it's important to talk about those artifacts because, as I said before, they are half hidden in these market stalls and no one cares about them. But it's important to create a passage, a bridge between the generation of my aunt, who is now 89 years old and still in good health, luckily, and the young generations who have not had any experience of the war firsthand. The young generation, they can learn about fascism with academic books through school. But this is a little bit distant, is a bit abstract. You don't really feel the cold, the hunger, the fear on your skin. But I argue that when you listen to my Aunt Graziella's anecdotes and you read about them and you see the artifacts, you can really feel that fear and you can really understand how fascism can affect every single aspect of everyday life and even change the neutrality of what is told at school. I'm just going to end here with a couple of pictures that show my process. First of all, I like sketching my drawings on very big paper, usually A3, but sometimes even bigger. And then I filled that in with the colors. And in the case of Motherland, I used oil pastels, watercolors, and touches of acrylics. The style is very childish, to try and represent the world through the eyes of my aunt Graziella. And also the text is quite childish because it's a rhyme like you find in illustrated books for little kids. But the content that that rhyme hits is much more complicated and difficult to put up with. After doing my drawings, then I spent months on Photoshop where I scan all the artifacts that I spent 4 years collecting. I cut little bits and I put them together in an harmonious way. And then I created a book. So thank you very much for this chat. I hope you enjoyed it. Motherland has been translated in English, but at the minute it's only available on the Italian market in the Italian version. However, my publisher Becco Giallo is in touch with the agents in the UK market, so we hope that it can hit the market one day. And if you have any lead, they are definitely welcome and appreciated. Thank you very much.
So, hello everyone. I'm Samya. I'm an illustrator, graphic designer, and artist based in Karachi, Pakistan. My work primarily, I work primarily as an illustrator, and a lot of my work focuses on Pakistani women. My own journey, growing up as a girl in Pakistan, and a lot of what I have been learning about feminism as well. So without further ado, let's just dive into my work. This is one of my sort of projects that kind of, started a lot of more projects that about women and about my own journey growing up as a woman in Pakistan. This series was called Women of My Land, and it was about my own experiences growing up in Pakistan and about the issues that I've sort of always related to or felt strongly about growing up. Just like briefly about each illustration here, the first one's called Cosmic Ninja, and it was about how a lot of times when people perceive Muslim women, especially in the West, I think they have this idea of us wearing, hijabs and niqabs, and being very straight women, very, we have this image where maybe we're very submissive. But I wanted to sort of sort of change that also of how people perceive Pakistani women, because that's not the truth. There are all kinds of women in our country. And even if you're religious, doesn't mean you can't be sexual or groovy, is what I called it here. So this was a sort of tongue-in-cheek illustration about that. The second one is sort of a bride in a semi-traditional outfit, and she's stepping on a groom's headgear. This was sort of in regards to marriage. Marriage is considered to be this like very, this integral part of a woman's life in our culture. And this was something that was personal to me because my family was, pressurizing me to get married when I entered my 20s, and I, pushed it off till I was in my 30s, which was a pretty big deal. So this was like very personal. The third one is actually a self-portrait, and that's me smoking a cigar. And this was controversial because in Pakistan, smoking, it's controversial, not because of health reasons, but because I'm a woman. So I wanted to, sort of put this image out there, and I called it Faz Girls. So Faz Girls is this kind of derogatory term that's used for women, to call women who are maybe sexually active or more provocative in our culture. So this is a term that's used often for women like us. So I called it Fast Girls. The fourth one is a little more emotional for me because the two women that are at the back of the illustration are two women who got murdered and killed in Pakistan. The first was a social media celebrity, and she was murdered by her own brother. And it was an honor, like what they call an honor killing. And the second woman is someone who's very close to me. She used to run this community center in the city where I live, Karachi. And she used to support LGBTQ people. She used to support all kinds of minorities in the country. And she was murdered also for holding a special, program about minorities that are being killed by Pakistani state. So, and this was a sort of the girl in front is a friend of mine, and I wanted to show her sitting in remembrance of these two women. And so I basically, this entire series was actually an album cover. Each was an album art with a song, and I animated them as well. And I just wanted to quickly show you guys, show you all the animations I made. I don't know if it's going to play here. Okay, sorry. I think my laptop might be taking a bit more time for it to play. But anyway, so just quickly telling you about it. So there was this song with each illustration. And I don't know if it's going to play, so I'm just going to go next. Yeah. Sorry, you can check it on my website. But these are basically animated illustrations, and they have songs which I made with my partner and a friend. And so they're kind of funny and interesting. So if you ever get a chance, you should check them out. Sorry, I'm just going to try going next. The next project that I'm going to show you is actually how I met Nicola here, Nicola Streeten. It was a part of our workshop that we did in Nepal. And it was organized by British Council, and it's called the Creating Heroines Workshop. And I wanted to take the series that I just showed you guys before, Women of My Land, forward and show all the different kinds of women we have in Pakistan. So, I was like, we have crazy women and strong women and women who fly. This is kind of actually coming from Islam, because we believe that our prophet traveled the seven heavens to meet God and, to sort of see the universe. And the story behind it is that there was a half human and half horse being that took him up on all these universes. And a lot of Muslims like to believe that it was a half woman and half horse creature. And so I wanted to show these women who fly and women who create sexy. But of course, then there are also women who are murdered and women who live in space. And Karachi is actually connected to the, Arabian Sea. So I wanted to also include one of the women, and I myself live in Karachi and I'm from Karachi. So this was part of that. So apart from my own personal illustrative work, I also do a lot of work as an illustrator. These are some of the book. The great part is that a lot of, in fact, the book covers that I'm sharing right now, there are 8 of them. And I believe like 7 of them are by South Asian authors and poets and writers. The first one is by a very revered Pakistani and Urdu poet, Parveen Shakir. Sorry. And you can see the remaining are also of South Asian women artists. And these were some more album covers, book covers that I've gotten to create. And they're interestingly all having to do with South Asian or Pakistani stories, and primarily written by female women authors. Along with my book covers, I also do a lot of editorial work. Herald magazine is like one of Pakistan's primary political magazine. Sorry. And so these are some illustrations I've gotten to make for their covers over the years. This one was primarily about the entire magazine was about women who have faced violence in Pakistan. So along with my editorial work, I also do a lot of book covers. Sorry, I'm just going to take a sip of water. Okay, so yeah, I do a lot of album covers too. These are all mostly Pakistani musicians. And there are all kinds of musicians who have done covers for. They're electronic musicians, there are rock musicians, some of these. And if you can, you should go check out their music. These are some documentary posters that I've gotten to do recently. The first two are in regards to Native Americans living in America. And both of these posters were about these really amazing men who are actually fighting for LGBTQ rights in the Native American community, and also for the political rights in America. And the third one is about Sri Lankan women learning to swim. And this whole documentary was made after the tsunami came in Sri Lanka. And, once after the tsunami, they realized that most of the people who drowned were women and kids because they did not know how to swim. And for women, it was because of, cultural reasons, they were not comfortable wearing swimming costumes. And so there's been a whole movement about teaching Sri Lankan women how to swim. These are some more posters that I got to create for a Pakistani series that came out last year. It's called Churels, which means and after being on the internet for a month, it got banned by the Pakistani government, but thankfully the ban was revoked after some weeks. And this whole series is very interesting because it's about these group of women who become these vigilantes, and they start taking revenge on Pakistani men who are sort of, violent and evil men, basically. And so they form this group. So I got to make a main poster for the series, and then there were these character posters as well. These are another series by the same director who made the Witches series. This was for a film, actually. It was called Cake. And this was our it was sent by the Pakistan, as our choice in the Oscars as the foreign movie category. And this was a film that did really well. And it was about two women as well. So I usually try taking a lot of women-centric projects, since this is something that's very close to my heart. This is just another project that I wanted to share because it was, from Nepal, and Nicola has been, we met in Nepal, so it holds that special place. I got to design this book bus that basically travels around Nepal, lending books to people. And this was a project by the U.S. Embassy in Nepal. I got to do the exterior of the entire bus. And I just love the idea that it travels around all of Nepal, just lending books to kids and people. This was a Google Doodle that I got to do last year. And the woman who's been illustrated is Iqbal Bano, and she's one of the most celebrated classical ghazal singers, which is basically singing these poems in our national language. And she's actually a really cool ball breaker woman because she stood up in her time against the dictator in Pakistan, who also brought he was the dictator responsible for Islamic extremism in Pakistan. And so she kind of stood up against him. He had banned the sari because it's considered an Indian outfit at that time. And she wore this sari in a stadium full of 50,000 people and sang ghazals by this poet who was also banned because he used to write a lot of revolutionary poems, and he was a big activist. So she sang his poems in this sari and ended up getting banned herself. And it was great that Google sort of highlighted her, and she was our Google Doodle for an entire day in all of Pakistan. These are another, I'm just going to quickly go through everything now. So these are just another series I worked on recently. It was exhibited at a gallery in here in Pakistan. And the idea behind the whole series was basically women occupying a planet without men, and all of us just partying and living in peace without having men there. And also all kinds of women. And this has also been something that's really important for me, because growing up, a lot of the culture and TV and music that we listen to and see in Pakistan is Western or very American influenced. So we would barely see ourselves represented in the, in all this entertainment or, art that we were taking in. And it's great to sort of be at least at the forefront of this in Pakistan, and to create illustrations with brown women and South Asian women and all religious women and fun women. And so just to make people realize that this is also a world that can exist. And so this is part of that series. This is actually, just wanted to include this because this is one of my last works that I've created. And I've really been thinking about working in, creating graphic novels and sort of, and this is, I got married very late in my life at the age of 32, which is a big deal in Pakistan because all women get married mostly in their early 20s. And so, and as women, it's very rare for women to live on their own in Pakistan before getting married. And basically, it's very rare for an independent woman to live on her own in Pakistan. And so I gained my independence after getting married. And this entire series was about that I felt I got freedom, because my partner is someone who completely understands me. And he's an open person himself. But I do feel I don't have that freedom once I go out of my new home. Because in public spaces, it's very men dominated. Our public spaces are very male dominated, and so it's very rare to see women out in public spaces unless there are some specific spaces that are designated for women. So this entire series was like coming to terms with those feelings. And this is the very last thing that I wanted to share with you all. It's a project I got to create for this Indian-based collective by the name of Karak. And they sort of released an anthology which features all kinds of South Asian writers, artists, illustrators, activists. And I collaborated with this poet from India, this woman poet from India who is amazing. And she just goes on the streets and she's like, all revolutionary and activist type. And I was just completely enamored by her. And this was about how we both feel in India and Pakistan, not safe in public spaces, and how we feel caged. And, we have to look at the time and go home. And when we go out, we feel men, sometimes they touch us, sometimes they're looking at us, sometimes they're, doing weird gestures with their mouths. So this was like, about these issues, and then also seeing a better side of it, another side. And I added, and all of these were animated, sorry, but I don't know if this animation is going to work. I tried including a lot of animations, but sadly they did not work. So you all can check it out on my website or Instagram. But I think, yes, that's about it.
So first, I should introduce myself. My name is Eleanor Davis. I'm a cartoonist and illustrator. Some examples of some of the kind of stuff that I do, some book covers of mine, and a couple illustrations. And today I'm excited to talk to you all about my newest book, which is called The Hard Tomorrow. If I can move, yeah. It came out from Drawn and Quarterly in fall of 2019. So as you could probably guess, The Hard Tomorrow is set in the near future. In the book, the near future is pretty horrifyingly a lot like what we're living through right now. In some ways, it's maybe even a little bit better than what we're living through right now, because I didn't anticipate the pandemic. So here are some panels from the book, sort of lots of different scenes from different parts of the book. There are two main characters in my book, Hannah and Johnny. Here Hannah is saying, "This is my favorite part of you, your eyelashes, when the light hits them like that." They are sleeping in their truck bed. Hannah has a job as a home health worker, and Johnny is supposedly building them a house in the woods. They have a plot of land that they want to build a house, but he's very busy smoking a lot of weed. Here's their homestead. You can see the concrete foundation that they've poured where the house is going to be. And while the house gets built, they cook and eat in that little trailer, and there's the truck they sleep in. Like real life, state violence is coming down around them. Here's a sort of a pivotal scene of the book. So this book is the most personal thing I've ever done, and I put a whole lot of my own life in there. My husband's mom, Lori, became terminally ill in the fall of 2016, and we spent a lot of time taking care of her for the next 3 years after that. So this is Phyllis, who's Hannah's main client. She's drinking sure while crying. She says, "My Jack did it right. His heart went and he was gone. My Jack did it right." So here's Hannah and her best friend Gabby driving around and stopping to hunt wild mushrooms. There are some more lighthearted of the book as well. So in my older comics, I feel like sometimes I'd try to smooth out the characters, thinking that would let me tell a clearer story or help readers identify with the characters. But in this book, I wanted to write something that was warmer and more like my actual life. And I wanted to write about people that were like me and the kind of people that I actually know and am friends with. So mostly queers and weirdos and nerds. Here's a meeting of Humans Against All Violence, Hannah's activist group. Hannah's an activist. I had kind of manically thrown myself into activist work after the 2016 election, which had, some very action-packed elements, but also just a lot of sitting around going to meetings. So here they're talking about how big their rally was. Oop. But then here are Hannah and Gabby getting kettled by riot police. So I was trying to include and sort of set down a dreamlike experience I had being a part of a crowd that got kettled at a Black Lives Matter march in Atlanta in 2014. So finally, a big part of the book is that Hannah and Johnny are trying to get pregnant, among everything else. My husband Drew and I had also decided to try to get pregnant in the spring of 2016, which is a pretty wild time to decide to have a baby. So I wanted to write a book that captured how the world felt to me in 2016 and 2017, that everything was ending and coming apart all at once, while at the same time the world kept continuing on. And with everything that's happened in the last year, the world feels like it's ending more than ever, but everything keeps continuing anyway. So I get asked about my process with making comics a lot, and the answer is it's really, really different for every comic. With The Hard Tomorrow, I sort of uncharacteristically, I don't usually do this. I wrote out a script of all the dialogue, and I edited the hell out of it. And then I did about 10 drafts of thumbnails. before going to the final art. So that's what my thumbnails look like on the left. They're pretty rough, but legible. And I do all the lettering on the computer. I do all my thumbnails in Photoshop for ease of editing, because it makes it easy to move the panels around and move the word balloons around. So you can see the comparison between the thumbnail on the left and the final art on the right. Here's another example from the very first page of the comic, the thumbnail on the left and the final art. It's just kind of cliche to say, but it's always really frustrating to lose the energy of my original thumbnails. And especially when the final art took around 10 months to finish, while the thumbnails took less than a month, even with so many drafts. So that's something I'd like to get better about. I heard that the LDC crowd is really into tool talk. So I'm just going to nerd out a little bit about my materials. I use a lot of different media. I do a lot of traditional and a lot of digital. But with the Hard Tomorrow, I just did the tried and true pen and ink on Bristol. I use Strathmore 400 series Bristol. Lower than that, it gets bleedy. Mechanical pencil with 2B lead. I don't understand how people use HB or any kind of H leads. They make me crazy. I also really love kneaded rubber erasers. My pencils can get really messy and gross, and I really hate inking over them. And I feel like the ink is getting swallowed by the pencil lines and I can't see what I'm doing. So I kind of roll a kneaded rubber eraser over the whole page to lighten the pencils up. So I can barely see them, and it lets the ink breathe. That's one of the, with kneaded rubber erasers, I got a bunch of them, and my teachers in like my drawing 101 class made me get kneaded rubber erasers. And I said, these things are so stupid. I'm never going to use these. And I've been using them religiously for the last 20 years. They're so useful. I really love dip pens. They've been around for about 200 years and nothing else has been able to replace them. If any of y'all out there use Croquill, I cannot recommend these Japanese Nico Muro pens enough. They are like head and shoulders above any of the other nibs I find in the US. Art stores usually sell Hunt nibs, and those just can't compare. I use Bombay Black ink. It's passable. It can get a little thick, but if you water it down, make sure to use distilled water, because if you use regular water, it can get really stinky. I do a ton of mistakes. Like my pages are like that thick with whiteout and pasted over bits, which that's just the way I work. I wish it was otherwise, but what you're gonna do? I use white gouache, which isn't great, but it's the best I've been able to come up with. I also paste on my patches with double-sided tape. So it's a very Frankenstein approach. And then after all that trouble and all that work, I still end up doing a ton of tweaks in Photoshop. So unlike with a lot of my other comics, I spent a really long time on the character designs for the Hard Tomorrow. I wanted these people to be individuals and not symbols. Hannah was the hardest to draw, and after drawing her hundreds of times, I still was never able to keep her on model. I had a problem where I could draw her nose pretty well looking up at it or from the side, but I had a really hard time drawing her nose like looking down on it. So that was a big hassle because I couldn't always avoid it. Hannah's husband, Johnny, on the other hand, was really easy to draw. I think often kind of goofier characters are easier to draw. There's less at risk, it feels like. But I am bummed that I forgot to put that Joy Division shirt in the final comic. Here's Gabby. She's the sort of dreamboat of the comic. She's Hannah's best friend. She's a naturalist. She's an activist as well. It took me a while to figure Gabby's jawline out. And it's also very important that it was really important that she and Hannah have really different body types and really different faces, because They have identical haircuts, which is kind of like a joke in the comic, is that their haircuts are very similar. So I had to make sure to differentiate them in other ways. Finally, here's Tyler. This is Johnny's incel survivalist friend. He's kind of started out as the villain of the story. He's a pretty nasty guy in a lot of ways, but something that I've noticed happens with me is whenever I draw somebody often enough, I kind of fall in love with them a little bit. So by the end of the comic, I had forgiven him for all his awfulness. And I got really excited when I was working on his character designs. There was like an aha moment where I realized I could give him like giant anime eyes. Sort of brought the whole character together. So I thumbed out The Hard Tomorrow in the spring of 2017. And I had a miscarriage in the summer of 2018, right when I started drawing the final art. But I got pregnant again that fall and it stuck. I finished drawing the book right at the start of my third trimester, and my parents and I brought our baby home from the hospital 3 months later, and Drew's mom, Lori, passed away that same evening in her home in Virginia with my husband by her side. So I don't know about y'all, but I spend most of my time worrying over life, like a dog worrying at a bone. I'm always trying to understand it, as if life is something that can be figured out and understood once and for all, even if I logically know that's impossible. So this book was my best attempt at capturing for myself what it means to be a person in this strange and terrible time we're all living through together. So it's really interesting to me that some folks read my book and find it hopeful, and other people find it despairing. I guess I think that in the end, we aren't guaranteed an answer or any kind of resolution. We're guaranteed a new sun rising every day. The sun on its own is ubiquitous and unimaginable and indifferent, and we give it its horror and we give it its hope.
Okay, hi everyone, good evening. Thanks for the invitation. Really happy to be here. So I'm Cedar Lewisohn. I'm a visual artist, writer and curator. So I'm a little bit maybe different from the other people who have spoken this evening, because I'm not really primarily a comic artist. I'm more of a visual artist curator, but I am interested in comics, as we'll see. So let me just share my screen. All right, so I thought I'd just start by talking about some comics that have influenced me over the years. I'm going to spend quite a while on this section, if you don't mind. So my grandmother owned a bookshop when I was young. So I used to spend a lot of time in her bookshop, and she had hundreds of books and lots of comics and lots of very old comics books, or kind of comics, but things like Punch and Beano and old comics like that. So that was definitely like my first experience of kind of comic books, or one page imagery with text kind of comic book stuff. And I always had a strange relationship with it. I sometimes liked them, I sometimes didn't. I used to be quite frustrated when I couldn't draw those the same way as those comics, but it was definitely a big influence and got me interested in the area. Then probably next, I probably got into something like Garfield, which I don't know, I haven't looked at Garfield for a long time, but I should probably get back into it. Probably it's quite a good attitude. And then a very big influence for me, I can't remember what age I would have been when I got into Von Bode. Von Bode is American comic book artist who had a very big, I'm not sure if everyone knows his work, but he was kind of around in the 70s, I suppose, 60s, 70s. And I can't remember if I was into graffiti before I was into Von Bode, or if I was into Von Bode then got into graffiti, but certainly around the same time. So probably around about 11, 12. And there's a very big crossover with Von Bode's work and the whole graffiti world. You can see here Cheech Wizard's one of his main characters, and the lettering in the Cheech Wizard was a big influence on early New York graffiti, and all the early graffiti writers in the 70s and 80s were very, very inspired by Von Bode. That's a picture of Von Bode as well. And he was a kind of fascinating character in himself as well. I can't remember how he described himself, but he was a kind of, I think he described himself as a New Age mystic. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but yeah, I remember it was really interesting. Just, you know, the way he looked was really a big inspiration as well. Just this amazing looking person that drew these far out like hippie comics. So he was a massive, massive inspiration on me, and I haven't looked at them for a while. They were also, you know, they were quite cheeky for a young boy. But yeah, they were good. I think a lot of people had similar influence in the kind of graffiti world. And I just put this text here, Von Bode graffiti lettering. I could do a whole lecture probably about the influence of Von Bode and graffiti lettering, but I thought I'd steer clear of it. Then later on I got into, well, maybe around about the same time, there were some British kind of comics, like Viz was very big, and there was one, there used to be one called Brain Damage. These kind of satirical English comics, which I used to get, and I was inspired by those. Again, they were kind of, all this kind of subversive. The quality of these images isn't very good. I just grabbed these offline, but it was you can already see they were quite subversive, especially for a kind of teenager. And some of the, you know, Viz is still going strong. Brain Damage is not so much. And then at the same time as well, I guess when I was about 14, 15, comics like Akira were very popular, these Japanese comics, because I was quite into the kind of graffiti scene. And I was never that much into Akira, as a matter of fact. I probably had a few copies, but I was never so into it as some people, but it was a big influence. I was much more into the kind of Von Bode type things. Then obviously Robert Crumb. I was never that into Robert Crumb actually, but more recently, or a few years ago, I've got more into Robert Crumb. There was always a bit of a kind of Robert Crumb or Von Bode, and I was always more into the Von Bode style things, but I have to give Robert Crumb a mention. And then I was more into Peter Bagg, Neat Stuff comics and Hate. I was really into those after getting into Von Bode around about the same time. And I can't remember how I discovered them. I think I was hanging around some comic shops in Greenwich or something like that. But I think the Pete Bagg was very important for me because it kind of introduced me to this kind of what I call kind of slacker comics, this kind of slacker lifestyle. Also, what was important about Neat Stuff and Hate at the time, because it was around at the time that I was into kind of grunge music, and they came out of Seattle. So it gave me this kind of alternative perspective on grunge, the grunge scene, and kind of felt like I had an in on what was happening. And you know, and I love the fact that Buddy Bramley in hated grunge. That was really cool. So then obviously, you know, Dan Klaus and Neat Stuff, huge influence, and that I think those really just kind of somehow raised the level of the storytelling in comics that was possible. So that was really fantastic, and I was really into those. And also it was just great, you know, these all translated obviously into films and graphic novels, but when I was getting these, it was actually getting, you know, slim little comic books, and they were quite hard to find, and I wouldn't get them in the right order. And, you know, it was way before the kind of graphic novels came about. And then Chris Ware, obviously after Dan Klaus, you got to mention Chris Ware, and that was this, you know, fantastic, weird world. And again, getting the actual little slim comic books was really sweet. But again, you know, it's really worth mentioning that the books that Chris Ware produces are amazing objects in themselves, the production value. And then I guess round about the time I'm at college, I went to art school. I went to art school in the 90s. I finished in 1999. And actually, Simona Lee she was kind of at college with me. She was just around in Camberwell. I used to see her all the time, and I don't even know if I knew she did comics. You know, I was really into comics kind of when I was at art school, but comics were never really, I did fine art and sculpture, and comics were not really something we were not considered something to be looked at. And so I don't even think I ever spoke to Simone about comics. I think she went to the Royal College at a later point, and then went off and did her own thing. And then years later, I just saw her name. I was like, oh wow, that's the same person. And we ended up, you know, we've worked together a couple of times now. I'm a big fan of Simona Lee's stuff, and she lives near me. Actually, she used to live near me in Brockley, so she lives near me in South London. So I see her around sometimes as well. But yeah, fan of Simone's stuff. some on stuff. And then there's some Japanese comics which I see, and I'm not, you know, these are just kind of random ones, but this one in particular I really liked because it has that same kind of slacker mentality. I was really happy to find a Japanese comic that kind of had the same vibe as the kind of neat stuff, but this was much more recently when I've been living abroad and I would go on long train journeys and I would read these comics when I was traveling. So a lot of these I'd just read when I was traveling, similar to this one. And I sometimes I just go into comic shops and just say, have you got any kind of like loser comics? And they kind of look at me and say, yeah, maybe this. So this is a couple of Japanese ones that I like. And then I was working in the Middle East for a while in Qatar, and I was doing some research into comic books in the Middle East and in the Gulf region. And I didn't find much, but I found a few things. And this was, probably most people have seen this, The Arab of the Future. But this was a really great, this was contentious because this is based on Iran, not the Gulf. So this didn't really fit into my research, but it was, again, this was a fantastic, for me, this was a fantastic comic in that realm of comic books in the kind of Gulf and Arab region. Okay, so then more recently, I've been looking at kind of this subgenre of comic books by visual artists. So this is one I picked up. It's City Stripes. I picked this up in a Zine fair or whatever, a book fair, and I really like this. This is a comic that is images from famous cities in comic books, like Gotham City, and all the images and people are taken out. So you just have these kind of cityscapes, and it's quite kind of when you speak to the person that does it, I can't remember his name. It's been a few years since I just found that it's quite anonymous. But it's just a thin little fanzine. But he's quite theoretical the way he talks about it. But I was very inspired by these this idea of the wordless comic. So that really put me onto this idea of wordless comics and these kind of stories of wordless comics. This is another one I picked up, another fair of some sort. This is a fine art student who's, yeah, she's made, it's a very limited number, Rezo printed. It's quite weird. She's actually into wrestling, female wrestling. So there's quite a lot. And I think this is a Rezo printed comic book. So yeah, this is why I dug this out for this talk and just made some bad photos. And this is another one again that I picked up. This is more of a book. I've got it right here actually. Is it here? Yeah, Jack Ramsey, Skit City. I only got that one image on it, but it's another one. It's another wordless comic. Actually, and from the style of it, it's funny that the guy that did this actually also comes from a graffiti background, which also interests me. But this is a great comic, and it's actually I can show you on the screen here as well. You can see the cover. But so this is more of a kind of small graphic novel. But yeah, I very much like the style. I'm very when I go to look at comics, I'm very fussy and choosy about the kind of drawing style. I'm a real snob about if I don't like the drawing style, like the way the lines are in a comic, then I'll just forget about it. So most of the things that I've shown you, that they have the kind of style of line drawing that I like. I can be a bit flexible sometimes, but not that much. So jumping onto some of my projects, so as I say, I work as a kind of, mainly I work as a curator in my day job these days and writing. So this is just some covers of, this is a publication I made when I first started working at the Tate Modern around 2007. And I was working on an exhibition which had a theme around kind of finance and the economy. The exhibition was called The Irresistible Force. And I was working with two other curators, and essentially we couldn't really agree on the content of the show. So I just said, okay, I'm going to just make a publication, and all my content will go to this publication, and we'll give the publication away as part of the exhibition. I think we printed 2,000, and they were just given away as part of the show, and the other curators did their show, and I made this publication. As you can see, the cover was obviously Margaret Thatcher, and on the back cover you can see this is a portrait of Steve Biko, the South African political activist. So what was important about this as well, I haven't showed you any of my earlier kind of fanzines. I was also making some kind of fanzines, or very cheaply produced, like limited run publications at the time. And what was important about this was, for me, the publication became a kind of platform for an exhibition. So it was the idea was that the exhibition could take place in the magazine. So the magazine was a kind of exhibition platform in itself. And there's lots of things we could go on about that, but I won't go into it too deeply. And then around a couple of years, that was around 2006, 2007. And then around 2008, I published my first book. This is street art that I published with Tate. I won't go into this, but it's been a big, a big aspect of my life, really. It was great to publish a book. One thing, because I'm dyslexic, so it was a big thing to like write a book. But I'd done lots of writing before, but I kind of just risked that I would actually be able to write a full book. The main thing I would say about this book is that it really took an art historical approach to graffiti and street art and tried to put them in some kind of historical context or art historical context. So bringing people like Brassai or the Situationalists or people like that into the discussion around graffiti and street art. And it was a big success, one of Tate's most popular books. And I did an exhibition off the back of the book that was also very popular. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to stick to printed matter for the time being. So then we get to some of my actual artwork. So this is an early work. This is a wood carving with spray painted background. It's not really a self-portrait, but kind of, it's a kind of caveman. And you know, at the time, it took a long time to get to this stage of working, this kind of clashing of styles. This is quite a big wood carving. You can see that's the wood block that it's printed from. It was hand printed. That block's about 4 feet by 4 feet. That was my studio at the time. I had a studio in Brixton. So you can see I was lucky I had this really big studio. You can see the kind of works I was making. It's around 2013 now. So then I was really into the idea of these very huge printed wood blocks, hand printed blocks. So this is a real massive wood block print, hand pressed. It took about 4 people we all pressed it by hand. The background is spray painted and pen. The foreground is wood block prints. So in order to do it, I can't even remember how I did it now, but I think we printed the same way actually as this one. So I first print the wood block, then I masked out the wood, then I masked out the images, and then I do the background. So it's kind of like this layered process. And then at this time as well, I was also just beginning to experiment with the subject matter. So this, as you can see, this is an Egyptian god and a Mesopotamian figure. So I was just starting to play around with these different worlds, these different like kind of worlds that I was researching online between a Mesopotamian god and an Egyptian, these different eras, these different epochs or whatever. And then also thinking about that in relation to the contemporary world. And that's an installation view of a show I did around, I can't remember when, 2014 or 15 probably. But it shows you some of the wood blocks. This is in Exeter. So what was also interesting about the show in Exeter, I did the show in the Contemporary Art Museum, but I also, we've jumped some dates here. This is in, I'll get back to this. I was in Maastricht. This is some very big books I made. I did a residency at a place called the Jan van Eyck Academy, and I'll show you the books that I made, and I'll maybe put them in the comments later. I'll show you some short films. But in the background, you can see the wood blocks I used, and you can see me turning the pages of the book there. That was a book of woodblock prints, and I made 2 copies. In the foreground here, you can see the black book, which I made, and there was 6 copies made. So these handmade books. So, and at the same time as that, I made this book, which was, I was doing all these kind of drawings. I would do like sets of 4 drawings. So I made this, everyone at the Jan van Eyck Academy, where I was doing the residency, everybody was mad on book making. We would have these book clubs and talk about books and talk about paper and talk about binding, and they were called in-labs, and everyone was crazy on bookmaking. They had a kind of section of the building where people would work on books and stuff like that. And so this is the Maastricht drawings book. So the first print I did of this, I just did 30 copies of this kind of handmade Riso printed book. And I really did make the book by hand. So this is the Riso printer that we did it with. These are the pages printed out. This is, and I cut these pages. So it was, I think this is the 30 copies of the book. You have to kind of, when you bind the book, it was perfect bound. You have to kind of walk around the table and assemble each book. So one at a time. So when you assemble the books, they look like that. And then you glue them in this old machine. You glue the spines, and then you have to weight them down like that. So it was really very much a hands-on bookmaking process, really nice. And you know, I worked with a great graphic designer on this who did the layouts and everything, and we, you know, thought about the paper and everything, and that was the finished book there. So I first did 30 copies of those. They went obviously, and then I did another 30, and then after that I did a leaf, can't even say it now, LIFO printed version. So the first two print runs were the Rezo, and then I did I think a LIFO printed one, which was like I think I did a print run of about 200, and then I think I did another 200. So they're quite small print runs, but the LIFO printing was not. Well, I just sent the files off to wherever it was, the printers, and got them back. It wasn't super handmade like the Rezo. And then this is the black book that I made. So this is this again, it's a very, very large book. It's as big as a table, basically. It's a huge book. I made 6 copies of this book, all hand printed screen prints. These letters, the letters on the cover, they're wood block letters. The letters are around 200 years old. They're made from cherry wood. So it's super rare kind of wood block printing that they had at the Jan van Eyck Academy. There's 2 different fonts. The top font is the cherry wood, and it's slightly old, and the bottom font is a slightly newer one. It might be 150 years old, but they know that the wood blocks are so old because they stopped making the blocks out of cherry wood at a certain time. So it was made. We did the printing, and then we printed it by hand, and then we reversed it and made a negative. So it's all in negative. And then these are some images from the book. The book was hand bound in a place called Nijmegen in the Netherlands. These are some so all the images in the book were based around images I was seeing in museums in the Netherlands or in the kind of Limburg region. I was really interested in kind of modernist artists who'd taken inspiration from African artworks. So I was looking like so this is I can't remember all the names now, but this might be. Oh, who else we got here? So this is Leger on one side, and I think you've got Gauguin on the other. So it's, you know, so it's, I mean, Leger is not necessarily an artist you think of as taking inspiration from African imagery, but he did lots of the kind of typical European modernists took a lot of inspiration from African imagery. I didn't put Picasso in it because he was too obvious, but I did put some other people in it like Basquiat. But these are just some pages. And on the left here, my left, you can see this is a Mesopotamian figure. So I was also playing with different kind of historic periods. Then I'm probably going to hurry up here. So these I'll just flick through. This is the wood carvings. This is the second book. This is the wood carvings. I'm going to rush through, and then afterwards, after that, I was. These are images from the show in Exeter. So I was drawing the objects in the museum's collection. I was drawing the African objects in the museum's collection. And there's more images from the collection. And then I had them made as these costumes. And so I had figures made of them. So it's like bringing these objects back to life, and I used those in performances and stuff like that. And then at the same time, I made this book of kind of short stories and bits of writings. And again, that was shown in the thing. It was only text. There was no images in the book. And you can see there's a lot of black and red going through the work. This is just a poster that was in a project in Hoxton Square of one of the wood carvings. And then more recently, I started to do these, I had a new studio, I moved house. I started to do these prints, these lino prints, and I decided to make 1,000 prints, wood carvings and lino prints. So this is like 1,000, I took 100 drawings and made 10 of each. So that's just an image of the studio with a small selection of them. And they were all different fades, you know, each print you can just see there were different kind of, it was like, so they're almost like animations, and I have made some animations of them. When you put them together, they kind of animate. So I've got 1,000 of these drawings. I'm just doing different projects with 1,000 of these prints. So I'm just doing different projects with these prints. So recently, this year, I decided to turn these prints into kind of like a wordless publication. That's why this publication has come about. I don't even call it a comic book, really. It's a kind of comic, but it's not. It's kind of like an abstract. It's kind of a comic, but there's not really any story. I didn't even select the image sequences. I just gave all the images, like 1,000 images, to the designer, poor designer, and said, what should we do with these? And I knew I wanted to, I designed the pages. So I looked at some other comics that I liked, and I designed the kind of how the pages should be, and he selected the images. So there's all basically we used around about 500 of the images. Well, we only used the linos for this first book, the Marduk Prophecy. And so I worked with this great designer, Josh Daniels, a young designer. He did the layout. Sorry about the quality of these pages, these slides. These are just a couple of pages. And then we put those all together. And then I worked with a Rezo printing company in London and worked on so we did a small print run. I think we did 200 for the first run, or of Rezo printed, and all red and white. So I'm very into red and white. This is another kind of design page. So I get the idea of the paper. And I work, and you know, I've got a copy of the publication here, but it's a very tactile object. The paper stock and everything like that, and the quality of the Rezo printing is very important to me. It's got kind of red staples. So what I like about this project is I don't really know what it is. Is it a graphic novel? Is it a comic book? Is it an artwork? I don't know what it is, and I like that fact. And so there's in the publication that you've got all these historic. Are we running out of time?
Running out of time.
Okay, I'm nearly finished. Thank you. So we've got historic imagery from Mesopotamia, Egyptians, African, West African imagery, and then some contemporary imagery from Lewisham, where I live. Some weird text bits. There's also some different kind of street signage. These kind of symbols you find in the streets, maybe slightly Masonic symbols, but different images I find in museums. This is an image from the printers. And actually that's it. So that's the back page, just a bird. The bird is an image from an artist called Roger Hilton. There's a modernist artist called Roger Hilton who that bird is based on. So there's a lot of different references going on basically. But yeah, that's a quick run through of some of my influences and the new publication I've made.